the beginning of something unexpected. The night was quiet in Los Angeles. The city lights shimmered softly through the thin curtains of Sandra Bullock's living room, painting a gentle glow on the floor. Her dog, Ruby, an aging golden retriever, rested her head on Sandra's lap. The actress smiled, brushing her fingers through Ruby's fur. There was peace in this small moment, but behind that calm, a silent worry lingered. Ruby had been sick for weeks, and the vet had said the words no pet owner wants to hear. Her condition is complicated. Sandra had tried everything, medications, home care, endless late nights researching online. She stayed up feeding Ruby warm broth when she refused to eat, talking softly to her like she was family. To Sandra, Ruby wasn't just a pet. She had been there through the hardest nights, the loneliest holidays, and the uncertain times after fame faded into silence. Ruby had been the one constant presence, loyal and warm. A soft knock broke her thoughts. It was late. She opened the door to see a man wearing a simple jacket and carrying a small brown box. When he looked up, she froze for a second. Standing there was Keanu Reeves, calm, kind-eyed, and quiet as always. "Hey," he said, smiling softly. "I heard Ruby hasn't been feeling great," Sandra blinked, surprised. She hadn't told anyone except a few close friends. "How did you—" she began. "A friend at the shelter mentioned," he said, stepping in gently. "I was there earlier helping out. They said Ruby was adopted from that same place years ago." His voice was soft, respectful, the kind that didn't intrude but somehow reached the heart. He placed the small box on her table. Inside, wrapped neatly, was a handmade wooden collar charm carved in the shape of a heart. On it were the words, "Thank you for staying." Below, a small engraving read, "For Ruby." Sandra felt her eyes sting. "Did you make this?" "I tried," Keanu said, smiling shyly. "I used to carve small things in my spare time. Thought maybe Ruby could wear something that reminded her she's loved." For a moment, silence filled the room, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that said more than words could. "You didn't have to do this," Sandra whispered. "I know," Keanu said quietly, glancing at Ruby. "But sometimes we don't do things because we have to. We do them because it matters." Sandra smiled faintly. Ruby wagged her tail weakly, her eyes softening when Keanu knelt beside her and gently stroked her fur. He stayed for a while, not talking much, just being there. Sometimes that was all Sandra needed. She didn't expect kindness to show up at her door that night, especially from someone who carried so much of it already. As Keanu prepared to leave, he turned back and said, "If Ruby feels up to it, I know a quiet place up north. There's a small lake where my dog used to rest. Maybe she'd like that." Sandra nodded, holding back tears. "Thank you," she whispered. When the door closed, she sat down beside Ruby again, her hand gently resting on the heart-shaped charm. For the first time in weeks, Ruby wagged her tail again. Sandra looked out at the night sky and whispered, "Maybe kindness really can heal." She didn't know then that this small act would lead to something far deeper, a journey that would test friendship, reveal hidden pain, and remind them both that love, in its simplest form, never fades. The quiet promise. The morning sun crept through the curtains, touching Ruby's golden fur with a faint glow. Sandra woke to the soft sound of her dog breathing beside her. Ruby seemed a little better that day. Her eyes brighter, her tail moving with effort but joy. Sandra smiled faintly. Maybe it was the medicine finally helping. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the small wooden charm now hanging gently from Ruby's collar. Sandra poured herself a cup of coffee and looked at it again. The charm was simple, hand-carved, slightly uneven, but it carried warmth. She remembered Keanu's quiet smile when he had handed it to her. There was something in his presence that didn't demand attention, yet somehow brought peace. He wasn't the kind of person who came to fix things with grand gestures. He simply made people feel seen. Later that afternoon, Sandra received a message from him. "Hey, I'll be driving up north this weekend. Thought about what I said last night, the lake I mentioned. It's calm, peaceful. Maybe Ruby would like it. I can pick you both up. No pressure?" She hesitated for a moment. Her schedule was packed with interviews, promotional calls, and meetings. But then she looked at Ruby, who had lifted her head as if understanding. Her tail brushed softly against the couch. Sandra smiled. Maybe this trip wasn't about escaping work. Maybe it was about remembering what really mattered. 2 days later, Keanu's motorcycle pulled into her driveway. A small trailer attached to the back with a cozy basket set up for Ruby. Sandra stepped out wearing a cap and sunglasses, her casual clothes making her look more like a traveler than a star. She laughed when she saw the trailer. "You built that?" she asked. "Yeah," Keanu said, scratching his head. "Safety first for the lady of the trip," Ruby barked weakly as if agreeing. The air filled with quiet laughter. There was something refreshing about this simplicity. No cameras, no noise, just kindness shared between friends. As they drove through winding roads lined with tall pine trees, Sandra found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. Keanu rode steadily, the wind rushing past them, the world around unfolding like a movie scene. Except this time, it wasn't acting. It was real, raw, and peaceful. After a few hours, they arrived at a small lake surrounded by mountains. The air smelled of pine and cool water. The surface shimmered under the sunlight, rippling softly with every breeze. Sandra helped Ruby down from the trailer, and the dog immediately walked toward the water, her paws touching the edge like she was greeting an old friend. Sandra watched quietly. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness but from relief. Ruby wasn't running like she used to, but she was walking again, slowly, proudly, as if showing that she wasn't giving up yet. Keanu sat down beside Sandra on the wooden dock. He handed her a thermos. "Green tea," he said. "I don't drink coffee anymore." "Since when?" she asked, smiling. "Since I started sleeping better," he replied softly. "It's strange how small things help." They both laughed quietly. The kind of laughter that didn't need punchlines, just shared peace. After a long silence, Sandra said, "You know, people always see the big things we do on screen, but they never see moments like this. This is what feels real." Keanu nodded. "The world moves fast. Sometimes we forget to sit still." For a while, neither of them spoke. Ruby lay beside them, her eyes half closed, the charm glinting softly in the sunlight. But under that calm, something unspoken lingered. Sandra noticed Keanu staring at the lake with a distant look. It was the kind of silence that held weight, like someone remembering a chapter they rarely opened. "You miss him, don't you?" she said gently. Keanu looked at her, slightly startled. Then he smiled sadly. "Yeah. My old dog, Sam, he used to come here with me. When things got hard, this was our place." His voice broke a little at the end. Sandra didn't say anything. She simply reached out and placed her hand gently over his. Sometimes comfort didn't need words. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Ruby stood up and looked toward the water again. Sandra followed her gaze and whispered, "She's happy." Keanu smiled. "Because she feels loved. That's all they ever want." They stayed there till dusk, watching the light fade. And in that quiet corner of the world, two friends found something they didn't know they had lost: hope. The night of quiet hearts, the lake shimmered under a silver moon that night. The stars reflected softly on the surface of the water, and the air carried a quiet hum of crickets. Sandra sat by the fire Keanu had built near the dock. Ruby was curled up beside her, snoring lightly, her head resting on Sandra's knee. It was peaceful, too peaceful. And that peace often carried memories, the kind that hurt in silence. Keanu sat across from her, staring into the flames. The orange light flickered across his face, revealing calm eyes that carried a deep sadness. Sandra watched him for a moment before speaking softly. "You know, I never asked," she said. "Why do you always choose to disappear like this? Away from everything? Away from people?" He smiled faintly, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "Because sometimes silence is louder than applause." Sandra frowned slightly. "You mean you don't like the attention?" "It's not that," he replied quietly. "It's just, I think fame makes people forget the small truths. They start chasing recognition, but they stop noticing kindness. I've lost enough people to know that the quiet ones, the ones who care without asking for anything, are the ones who matter most." His words sank deep into her heart. She thought about her own life, the awards, the headlines, the red carpets. All of it glittered so brightly, yet in that glow she had lost pieces of herself. The nights alone, the silence after applause, it all suddenly made sense. Ruby stirred in her sleep, letting out a soft whine. Sandra gently petted her fur. "She used to run around so much," she said softly. "I thought she'd always be there. I never realized how fast time moves until she started slowing down." Keanu nodded. "That's how life reminds us to pause. The people or pets we love, they grow old quietly. They don't ask for attention. They just stay near us until we learn what presence really means." There was something in his tone, gentle but filled with unspoken weight. Sandra sensed that his words weren't only about Ruby. "You still visit Sam's grave?" she asked. He looked up, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Every year, same date. I bring him his favorite old toy. The vet told me once that dogs never forget who they love. I think the same goes for us," Sandra smiled faintly. "You never told me that." "Some things aren't meant to be told," he said, looking at Ruby. "They're just meant to be felt." The night deepened around them, soft and still. The sound of the water brushing against the shore was the only thing breaking the silence. It felt like time had slowed down, two souls finding comfort in quiet pain. Then Keanu stood up slowly and walked to the edge of the dock. He looked out at the reflection of the moon. "You know," he said softly, "when I carved that charm for Ruby, I didn't think it would mean anything. But when I saw her wearing it, I realized something." "What?" Sandra asked. He turned to her, his voice low but steady. "Maybe kindness isn't supposed to fix everything. Maybe it's just meant to remind us that we're not alone." Sandra didn't respond. She couldn't. Her throat tightened. All she could do was look at him, this man who carried so much pain and yet gave so much peace. The wind grew cooler. Keanu added another piece of wood to the fire. The flames rose, flickering against the night sky. After a long silence, Sandra whispered, "You've always been like this, haven't you? Helping people quietly, then disappearing." Keanu smiled slightly. "You make it sound like a secret mission." "Maybe it is," she said. "A mission to remind the world that kindness still exists." He chuckled softly, then said, "If that's true, you're part of that mission too. You just do it with stories." She looked at him surprised. "Stories?" "Yeah," he said, smiling gently. "The way you live, the way you care, it tells stories people need to hear. Maybe not on screen, but here, with Ruby, with people who matter." Her eyes glistened as she whispered, "You really think so?" "I know so," he replied. The fire crackled softly between them. Ruby let out a deep sigh, her tail twitching against the grass. Sandra looked at her and then back at Keanu. "You know," she said quietly, "if Ruby gets better, I want to do something. Maybe a foundation for older pets, the ones people forget." Keanu's face softened. "That's beautiful. If you do it, I'll help." She smiled faintly. "You always say that, and I always mean it." Their eyes met across the firelight. Two people bound not by romance, but by something deeper. Shared silence, shared understanding. The night stretched on, and as the fire slowly dimmed, so did the distance between their hearts. That night, before sleeping, Sandra whispered to Ruby, "We'll make something good out of this, I promise." And as the wind rustled softly through the trees, Ruby opened her eyes for a moment as if she understood. The storm and the secret the next morning came with soft rain tapping gently on the cabin roof. The lake was covered in a light mist, the mountains hidden behind clouds. Sandra stood by the window, holding a cup of tea and watching the fog dance across the water. Ruby lay on a blanket near the fireplace, breathing steadily. She seemed peaceful. Almost too peaceful. Sandra's heart sank for a moment as she watched her chest rise and fall. She was afraid of what the next silence could bring. Keanu walked in quietly, carrying 2 plates of breakfast, eggs, toast, and some fruit, simple but warm. "Morning," he said softly. "How's she doing?" "She's resting," Sandra replied, forcing a smile. "She's strong, stronger than me sometimes." Keanu smiled faintly. Dogs always are. They love without thinking, forgive without waiting, and stay until we learn how to let go. His words lingered in the air like a quiet truth. Sandra sat down beside Ruby, running her fingers through her fur. "She's been my shadow for 15 years, she whispered. Every movie set, every hotel, every heartbreak, she was there." Keanu nodded slowly. "Maybe that's why she's still fighting. She knows she's your heart." As the rain grew heavier, thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm rolled over the mountains quickly. By noon, the lake turned restless, the wind pushing waves against the shore. Sandra stood on the porch watching the rain fall in sheets. "It's like the world's crying with me," she murmured. Keanu stepped beside her, holding an umbrella. "Maybe it's washing away the sadness." She smiled faintly. "You always find light in dark days." "Someone has to," he said, looking up at the clouds. "I've been through enough storms to know they never last forever." His voice carried weight. She could feel it, the pain behind his calm. And that pain had a story she didn't know yet. That evening, the power went out. Candles flickered across the wooden walls, casting long shadows. Ruby stirred in her sleep, whimpering softly. Sandra rushed to her side. "Shh, it's okay," she whispered, wrapping her in a blanket. "You're safe." Keanu knelt beside them, placing his hand gently on Ruby's paw. "She's tired," he said quietly, "but she's still holding on." For a long moment, they just sat there, listening to the sound of rain and the dog's faint breathing. Outside, thunder cracked loudly, shaking the windows. Sandra flinched, tears forming in her eyes. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I don't want to lose her." Keanu looked at her, his expression soft. "Fear means love is real. We don't fear losing what doesn't matter." Her tears fell then, silently. She leaned against his shoulder and he didn't move. He just let her cry. The storm raged, but inside the cabin there was stillness, a stillness that came only when two hearts carried the same pain. After a long silence, Keanu spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "There's something I didn't tell you," he said. "About Sam?" Sandra lifted her head slightly, wiping her eyes. "What is it?" He hesitated, staring at the firelight. "Sam didn't just pass from old age. He saved me." Her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Keanu took a deep breath. "Years ago, when I was going through the hardest time in my life, when I lost my family, I didn't want to keep going. I didn't see a reason to. And then one night, I came home and found Sam sitting by the door. I had rescued him from a shelter. But that night, he rescued me. He stayed beside me every single day after that. He'd nudge me to eat. He'd sleep near the door until I got up. He reminded me there was still life left to live." Sandra's eyes filled again, but this time with understanding. "So that's why you made that charm for Ruby?" He nodded slowly. "Because I know what it feels like when someone or something saves you quietly." The room went silent. The storm outside softened, as if listening. Sandra took a deep breath, looking at Ruby. "She did the same for me," she whispered. "After my breakup, after my dad passed, Ruby never left my side. She was my reason to smile." Keanu placed a hand over hers. "Then maybe it's time to thank her. Really thank her. Not with sadness, but with love." The way he said it made her chest tighten. She realized then that this trip wasn't just for Ruby, it was for her. To find peace, to let go of guilt, and to remember love doesn't end when life changes. As the rain finally slowed and the first hint of moonlight broke through the clouds, Sandra looked at Keanu. "You know," she said softly, "maybe this storm wasn't a bad thing." He smiled gently. "Storms remind us what truly matters when everything else fades." She looked back at Ruby and whispered, "Thank you for staying." Outside, the world was calm again. The storm had passed, but in their hearts, something had changed. Something had healed. The letter by the lake. The morning after the storm felt new. Sunlight spilled across the wet grass, the air fresh and cold. The world seemed washed clean, as if nature itself had started over. Sandra opened the cabin door and let the breeze in. Ruby lay by the window, her eyes open and calm, watching the sunlight dance across the wooden floor. Keanu was already outside, kneeling by the lake. He was fixing a small wooden box, something he had carved the night before while she slept. The quiet hum of his hands working with care. The faint scrape of a small knife against wood filled the soft morning air. Sandra walked out, wrapping her scarf around her shoulders. "You're awake early," she said softly. Keanu smiled without looking up. "The lake looks peaceful after a storm. Reminds me that even the roughest nights have gentle mornings." "What's that?" she asked, pointing to the box. He held it up for her to see. It was small, carved from light brown wood with tiny hearts etched along the lid. On top, in soft letters, he had engraved, "To those who stay even when it hurts." Sandra's eyes glistened. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's for Ruby," Keanu said quietly. "A memory box. I thought maybe you could put her collar in it one day when the time comes. Not now. Just when you're ready." She looked down at the box, her throat tightening. She wanted to protest, to say that Ruby still had time, that she wasn't ready to think about losing her. But something inside her knew Keanu wasn't talking about death. He was talking about love and the way it lingers long after someone is gone. Ruby stirred, her weak legs trembling as she tried to stand. Sandra rushed to her, helping her out onto the deck. The dog sniffed the cool morning air and wagged her tail slowly. Keanu watched quietly. "She's strong," he said. Sandra smiled through tears. "She's always been stronger than me." They walked together to the lake, Ruby between them. The water rippled softly under the sunlight, the same place where they had watched the storm the night before. Sandra knelt down and dipped her hand into the water, letting the cold run through her fingers. "This place," she said softly, "it feels like it knows how to hold pain." "It does," Keanu replied, "because pain isn't the end. It's a sign that love existed." She looked at him, her heart heavy yet full. "You always know what to say." "Only because I felt it," he said. "Sometimes silence teaches us better than words ever could." They sat there for hours, not talking much, just watching Ruby wander near the edge of the lake. Every now and then, she'd look back at them and wag her tail, as if saying, "Thank you for bringing me here." By afternoon, Sandra went inside to make tea. As she opened her bag, a small folded paper fell out. She picked it up, confused. The handwriting was careful and familiar. It was Keanu's. She unfolded it slowly and read, "Dear Sandra, I know you love her more than words can ever hold. But if the day comes when Ruby grows too tired, take her to the lake. Let her rest where peace is easy to find. And remember, grief is love without a place to go. Give it a home, not a cage. Build something in her name. Maybe a shelter, maybe a story. But don't let that love fade. Because kindness, once given, never disappears. It only changes shape." Her eyes filled with tears. She turned toward the window and saw Keanu still by the lake, skipping small stones across the water. She walked out holding the note. "You wrote this for me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Keanu nodded softly. "I started it last night. I wasn't sure if I should give it to you. But I figured, sometimes words need to find the right moment." Sandra's lips trembled. "You don't know what this means to me." "I do," he said quietly. "Because I once needed someone to tell me the same thing." She folded the letter gently and tucked it into her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she whispered. "For being here. For everything." Keanu smiled faintly. "You don't have to thank me. Friendship doesn't keep score." As the day faded into golden light, Sandra sat beside Ruby, brushing her fur gently. Keanu played a soft tune on a small harmonica he carried, the sound floating over the lake like a whisper. It wasn't a song people would recognize. It was slow, tender, and filled with emotion. For a brief moment, Sandra imagined time stopping. No pain, no fear, just three souls sharing peace before the world turned again. Ruby slowly lowered her head into Sandra's lap, eyes closing. The charm on her collar caught the last beam of sunlight and glowed faintly, like a tiny heartbeat of light. Sandra whispered, "We love you, Ruby." The breeze carried her words across the water, soft and endless. Keanu looked up at the sky and said quietly, "Every goodbye leaves a light behind." That evening they stayed out long after sunset. The stars reflected on the still lake, and somewhere between silence and memory, Sandra realized something had changed forever. Kindness had healed more than her heart. It had taught her how to say goodbye with love instead of fear. The gift that never faded. The next morning the world was silent. The lake shimmered with soft golden light, the kind that comes only after a long night of peace. Birds moved through the trees, and somewhere far across the water, the wind whispered softly through the hills. Inside the small cabin, Sandra woke up slowly, her head resting near Ruby's blanket. For a few seconds she smiled, then her eyes fell on the still shape beside her. Ruby lay quietly, her body warm from the blankets but unmoving. Her chest no longer rose. Her eyes were closed, calm and free of pain. Sandra froze, the air leaving her lungs. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched Ruby's fur. It was soft, still familiar, but the silence around her felt heavier than ever. "Ruby," she whispered. Keanu stood by the door, not saying a word. He had known. He had felt it the moment he woke and looked at the light in the room. It carried that strange stillness that comes after love has said its last goodbye. Sandra's tears fell quietly. She didn't cry loudly. She didn't scream. She just held Ruby close and whispered, "Thank you. Thank you for staying." Keanu knelt beside her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. "She waited for morning," he said softly. "She wanted you to see her go in peace." Sandra nodded, though her heart broke with every breath. "She always waited for me," she whispered. "Even at the end." For a while they stayed like that. No words, no sound except the soft rustle of leaves outside. When Sandra finally stood, Keanu helped her lift Ruby carefully. They carried her to the lake, where the sunlight danced on the surface like liquid gold. Keanu had already dug a small space near the willow tree that leaned over the water. Together they laid Ruby down, her charm still around her neck. Sandra placed the little wooden box beside her, the one Keanu had carved with the note folded inside. Before covering the spot, Sandra placed a single wildflower on Ruby's paw. "You gave me everything," she whispered, her voice breaking. "So now I give you this place, peace, sunlight, and love that never ends," Keanu added softly. "And every time the wind moves here, it'll carry her spirit. She's part of this place now." They stood in silence for a long time. Sandra's tears kept falling, but something inside her began to calm. Grief still hurt, but it didn't feel like darkness anymore. It felt like love, quietly taking a new shape. That evening, as the sun lowered over the lake, Sandra sat on the porch with Keanu. She held a notebook in her hands, Ruby's notebook. Pages filled with small notes about her, memories, funny habits, and little drawings from over the years. "You were right," she said finally, her voice soft but steady. "I'm going to build something for her. A place where older dogs can rest. A place filled with love and quiet." Keanu turned to her, his expression warm. "What will you call it?" She smiled faintly. "The Heart That Stayed," he nodded slowly. "That's perfect." A few weeks later, back in Los Angeles, Sandra started the foundation. It began small, just a simple rescue home for aging pets. But as word spread, donations poured in. Actors, directors, and even fans joined hands. People came not just because of her fame, but because of the story. One evening during the opening ceremony, Sandra stood on stage holding Ruby's charm in her hand. She looked out at the crowd and spoke softly. "This place began with one act of kindness. A friend once reminded me that love doesn't disappear. It only changes form. This foundation is for every soul that loved without asking for anything back." In the front row, Keanu watched quietly, smiling. He didn't like attention, but when Sandra looked at him, she knew he understood. After the ceremony, she walked over and hugged him tightly. "You gave me more than I can ever repay," she said. He shook his head. "You gave love a new home. That's all that matters." Months passed and the foundation grew. Photos of rescued animals filled the walls, each with their own small charm hanging by their collar. A heart carved with the words, "Thank you for staying." It became a symbol of hope. Every visitor who came left with one thought in their heart, that kindness never fades. It just finds new hearts to live in. One evening, when the sun dipped low and the golden light covered everything, Sandra walked alone to the small garden behind the shelter. There, under a willow tree, was a bronze statue of a golden retriever with a small wooden charm hanging from its neck. She smiled and whispered, "We did it, Ruby." Behind her, Keanu approached quietly, holding a bunch of flowers. "Thought she might like these," he said. Sandra took them gently and placed them at the base of the statue. "She would," she replied softly. They stood there together, not saying much. The light was warm, the world calm, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and love. Keanu finally said, "You know, maybe Ruby didn't just save you. Maybe she saved me too." Sandra turned to him, surprised. He smiled. "She reminded me that love doesn't vanish. It just changes the way it stays." Sandra looked at him, her eyes full of gratitude. "You always find the right words, Keanu," he chuckled softly. "Only when they belong to someone else's story." The two of them stood there until the sky turned orange and gold. And as the wind moved gently through the trees, it carried with it a soft jingle, the faint sound of a heart-shaped charm swinging from a collar somewhere in memory. And for both of them, that sound would forever mean one thing, that love never truly leaves. It simply learns to stay in a different way.